Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Thank you, Dean Carter, for the introduction. I'll be reading from Psalm 18, verses 1 through 6. The New Living Translation reads as so. I love you, Lord. You are my strength. Lord is my rock, my fortress, and my Savior. My God is my rock in whom I find protection. He is my shield, the power that saves me, and my place of safety. I called on the Lord who is worthy of praise, and he saved me from my enemies. The ropes of death entangled me. Floods of destruction swept over me. The grave wrapped its ropes around me. Death laid a trap in my path. But in my distress, I cried out to the Lord. Yes, I prayed to my God for help. He heard me from his sanctuary. My cry to him reached his ears. I would like to tag this text with the title, Placed for a Purpose. Placed for a Purpose. My sisters and brothers, we are living in a time where we need God's help. The psalmist says the ropes of death entangled me. In our time, we find the ropes of death entangling us. Through what seems to be unceasing violence at home and abroad, in schools and in churches, my sisters and brothers, we are living in a time where we need God's help. The text says, floods of destruction swept over me. And in our time, we find the floods of destruction sweeping over us as the Mississippi River floods. My sisters and brothers, we are living in a time where we need God's help. In my distress, says David, I cried out to the Lord. Yes, I prayed to my God for help. And many of us, too, are in times of distress. Distress because of finances. Distress because of educational inequality. Distress because of gender inequality. Distress because of dysfunctional homes. Distress because innocent human beings are being murdered. My sisters and brothers, we are living in a time where we need God's help. But I have good news for you. God is consistently hearing our cries and constantly helping us in our times of distress. But how? How is God helping us to endure the trials and tribulations of this earth? Well, I submit to you today that God helps us by working through us. God places us for a purpose. That is to say, we find ourselves in the place and the time we're in for a reason, and part of that reason is to help one another. There was a queen who was placed for a purpose in the year 473 BC. God worked through her to save her people from death and destruction. Her name was Esther. Esther found herself queen to King Xerxes, who at the time reigned from India to Ethiopia. And there was a man named Haman who had been promoted to a high-ranked position by King Xerxes, and as custom, in that time he expected others to bow down to him. Well, a man named Mordecai, who was Esther's first cousin, refused to bow down, and this angered Haman. So much so that Haman petitioned King Xerxes that a day be set aside to destroy all Jews. King Xerxes, not knowing that his new queen Esther was a Jew, signed off on the idea. Now, if Haman had been a white supremacist in the 19th or 20th century, he might have gathered a lynching mob together. However, that is not the time in which Haman was placed. So Haman had a 75-foot gallows be made to hang Mordecai from for the day that the Jews were to be destroyed. Once Mordecai found out about the day designated to destroy the Jews, he communicated to his cousin Esther to petition the King Xerxes to help the Jews. Esther was hesitant, for there was a law that any man or woman who came to the king's inner courtyard without an invitation was to be put to death, unless the king extended his golden scepter to whomever came. And essentially, Mordecai responded like this: don't think for 1 minute that your life will be spared simply because you're a queen. In fact, if you don't speak up, help from God will come from elsewhere, but you and your family will surely die. Then Mordecai said, but who knows? Maybe it was for a moment like this that you have been placed here. Placed for this purpose, to save your people from death and destruction. Esther responds, even though it is against the law, I will go to the king. And if I perish, I perish. Well, Esther did go before the king, and King Xerxes accepted her with his scepter and proclaimed that the Jews would be able to defend themselves. And so they did and were saved, and the king had Haman hanged from his own gallows. Now, if you read the book of Esther in its entirety, you'll find that the name of God is nowhere directly mentioned. And this is not to indicate that God is not active in our everyday lives, but rather to magnify the fact that God works through us to help each other. But God didn't only work through Esther in the year 473 BC. He also worked through people living in the 19th and 20th century in America, one of whom was Ida B. Wells. Ida B. Wells found herself placed for a purpose in the 19th and 20th centuries, a time when African Americans were being lynched regularly. And more often than not, when a man was lynched, the supposed reason was for that lynching was that he had assaulted a white woman. Well, Ida B. Wells had a friend, Thomas Moss, who was an owner of a grocery store, which he had opened in 1889. Moss was doing well for himself. In fact, if you asked the white store owners across the street, they would say he was doing too well because he was competing with their business. Well, on a day that Wells was out of town, Moss's grocery store was attacked by a white mob. Now, Moss attempted to defend himself, but alas, it was to no avail. Moss was arrested and jailed, and while in jail, a mob came and invaded the jail and lynched him. Upon Wells' return, she was distraught, but she recognized that she was placed in this time for a purpose. Upon investigation, Wells discovered that the true causes for lynchings were often because African Americans were progressing economically. Wells spoke truth to power, writing the true reasons for lynchings in pamphlets. While away from her office where she published her works, a white mob came and destroyed the office, forcing Wells to leave the South for another 30 years. But this didn't stop Wells. She traveled around Europe and continued to speak out against lynchings, which created international support against lynching. Even when asked to stop speaking out against lynchings and solely speak out for the women's suffrage movement, Wells refused to turn a blind eye to injustice and violence. And it was in part because of the awareness that she brought that lynchings began to decrease. Ida B. Wells was placed in a time when African Americans needed God's help, and it was through her that God sent God's help. God used Esther and God used Ida B. Wells, but God can also use you and me. But we have to be willing to be like Esther and Ida B. Wells and embrace an attitude of, if I perish, I perish. But I will be my brother and sister's keeper. For most of us, embracing an attitude of, if I perish will not result in us physically perishing, but maybe our popularity will perish. Family and friends may instruct us not to speak up for others, to not take action when our fellow human beings are in need, but rather to mind our own business because we have our own problems to deal with. But we must respond. If I'm going to be a Christian, I must follow Jesus Christ and address both the social and spiritual needs of others. After Jesus told the parable of the Good Samaritan, who felt compassion for the Jewish man robbed by bandits, unlike the priest and the Levite, who continued on their journey, paying no mind to this man, he asked his disciples, which of these three men, the Levite, priest, or Samaritan, was this man's neighbor? And the disciples replied, the Samaritan. Jesus then said, go and do likewise. Go and do likewise. This is the instruction that Jesus gave us, to make our sisters and brothers' problems our own and assist them in whatever capacity we can. My brothers and sisters, we're living in a time when there are those who don't recognize that all of humanity is placed for a purpose, but instead have purposed themselves to keep others in their place. But know today, nobody can keep you in a place that is not divinely designed for you to be in. To those in the Hispanic and African American community, there are those who want to keep you in your place, but know today that your heritage, culture, ethnicity, and complexion is not inferior to anybody else's. But you have been divinely placed, and you have a divine purpose, a purpose to be the help to the neighbors that need you. To the girls and women in the world, there are those who want to keep you in your place, but know today that your gender is not inferior to anybody else's, and that you as a woman have been divinely placed by God, and you have a divine purpose to be the help that your neighbors need. To those in the LGBTQIA community, there are those who want to keep you in your place, but know today that your sexuality is not inferior to anybody else's, and that you have been divinely placed, and you have a divine purpose to be the help that your neighbors need. To those in the Muslim community, there are those who want to keep you in your place. In fact, there are those who want to keep you out of this place, the United States of America. But know today that because you embody peace, and because you submit yourself to God, and because you do not affirm the perverted practices of ISIL and other terroristic groups like it, your religion is not inferior to anybody else's. And that you have been divinely placed, and you have a divine purpose to be the help that your neighbors need. Yes, we all have been divinely placed, and we all have a divine purpose to help one another. So as we embark on a new year, let us embrace the attitude of Ida B. Wells and Esther. If I perish, but I will fight for what is right. As we embark on a new year, let us be mindful of the words spoken by Mordecai to Esther, that maybe it was for a moment or time like this that you are where you are. As we embark on a new year, let us be mindful of the words spoken by Fannie Lou Hamer. You can pray until you faint, but if you don't get up and do something about it, God's not going to put it in your lap. So I encourage you today to be the help that others need. Thank you.